Here we go again. Share screen. We are now reading Sarah Bishop, chapter 8. And I have to move things so I can see. This is where we're at. Yep, chapter 8. Make it a little bit smaller. Okay, here we go. So the farm got burnt down. That group of patriots, they're running around burning barns and homes of people that support the British, and they are what they're doing what is called tar and feathering. So Sarah's dad was tarred and feathered, and they went to the Jessups and they cleaned him up, but he ended up dying. Because tar is hot and it's probably toxic. But Mrs. Jessup is where Sarah's staying. And then because her brother Chad used to work at the Lamb and Lion in the kitchen, he's off to war. So she's going to go and get herself a job or ask for work. So smart cookie right there. She's got to figure it out. She's got left. Nothing's left. Okay, here we go. Chapter 8. The tavern was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Pennywell. It sat upon a hill that overlooked the estuary that opened into the East River. It was a big white building trimmed in green and had 2 stories with 6 dormer windows. There was a dormer window as ones that I believe has shutters. There was a wooden gold sign hanging over the door that showed a lamb and a lion lying together under a spreading oak tree. Mr. Pennywell had long hair and mean little eyes that were set too close together. But as things turned out, he wasn't mean at all. When I told him that I was Chad Bishop's sister, he gave me a job in the kitchen right off, saying that he needed help bad, that Chad was a fine boy, that he was sorry to hear about the farm and my father's death. All of the girls I've had in the last month, he said, since the militia moved into the fort up on the Brooklyn Heights, only thought about one thing: soldiers. A seedy looking lot they are too. No uniforms, most without muskets, just farm boys. He gave me a good breakfast before I started work: eggs and ham and corn cakes. Mrs. Pennywell cooked it. She had a pretty face. At least, it must have been pretty before she got fat and her nose sort of melted into pink and white folds. Eat up, she kept urging me when I slowed down. You look peaked. Don't blame you. Can you bake bread? The militia boys come down here half starved, and baked bread hits the spot. You should be able to bake real good, cooking for your family as you've done for 2 years now, isn't it? I can bake, I told her. What do you need? Indian maize, rye flour, and white flour. Have them all, fresh from the mill. She bustled off and came back with 3 sacks. There was no special way I had to make bread besides the equal parts of rye and cornmeal and white flour. Also, you can use water, but milk is much better if you have it. Then you add salt, aplenty, and a gill of yeast to the quart of milk or water. Like all other bread, it should not be made so thick that you can't stir it well with your hand. I made 2 dozen big loaves, all the 2 ovens would take. They turned out well, golden brown and bursting. The militia boys ate the 2 dozen loaves in a hurry. They came trooping in from the fort late in the afternoon. There were about 30 of them. I looked for Chad and inquired, but none of the soldiers knew him. One of the boys from a village near Hampstead said that he would ask at the fort and let me know. I needed work, for I had no money, but the real reason I was here at the tavern was to find out about my brother. I could think of a little else. We were standing at the kitchen window, a big one with a dozen small panes, one of them broken and papered over. A bird tried to fly in, poor thing, thought it was flying through air. Mrs. Pennywell said, "The world is full of surprises, my dear, things that seem what they ain't. We have new glass ordered, but the way things are now, there's no telling when we'll get it." I heard the militia officers before I saw them coming riding out of the dusk. The hoofs of their horses struck fire on the stone. They shouted as they galloped up to the inn. The sounds were the same ones I had heard on the night that Birdsall and his mob came to destroy our farm. Suddenly, I felt pale and fearful. "Don't mind the clatter," Mr. Pennywell said. "They're just trying to keep their spirits up." He pointed down the hill at a stretch of water I had not noticed before. It was swarming with tall-masted ships. Admiral Richard Howe sailed in this morning early. There must be 100 ships out there lying snug up to Staten. Twice that many boats. You can see them scurrying about between the ships and the shore. They're landing soldiers, British soldiers. You can see tents going up on the island if you look close. You'll see 100 flags flying. That's why the rebels shout and wave their hats. They're scared, but don't want anyone to know how scared they are. I set another batch of bread to rise and carried trays into the dining room. Before I went in, Mr. Pennywell cautioned me to keep my opinions about the war entirely to myself. Today, he said, we are in the hands of the rebels who sit up there on Brooklyn Heights. Tomorrow, it may be different. We may be in the hands of the British, and the fort may be full of British soldiers. Also, there is usually a spy or two loitering around on one side or the other with ears cocked. Remember, the Lamb and Lion is neutral. I served the food and kept my mouth closed tight, but still I listened to what was said, hoping that my brother's name would be mentioned. I hoped in vain. I planned to ask officers, as I had asked the soldiers, if they had ever heard of Chad Bishop and where I could find him. Okay, so she got the job, and she's a bread baker. I can't talk. So she's baking bread. They've got the Patriot boys are coming in, right? Those are the people that are against the British. And then they've got British troops coming in with boats, and they can see all the tents setting up. So there are a lot of soldiers, and where she's working, they just have to stay neutral. So chapter 9, here we go. My room was high up under the eaves. It had a small window that looked out on New York Bay. When I went up to bed that night, I could see the lights of the British ships. There were hundreds of them twinkling in the dark night. I lit a candle and read from the Psalms. I knelt down and prayed to the Lord that there would never be a battle, and if there was, that Chat would not be in it, and if he was in it, that he would not be hurt. Drums and the far-off sound of marching feet awakened me at dawn. When I went down to the kitchen, Mr. Pennywell told me not to be alarmed. There'll be much drum beating and soldiers marching, he said, but there won't be any battles for a week or more, perhaps not then. I hear that Benjamin Franklin is coming up from Philadelphia to talk to Sir William Howe, the British general, about making peace. Let's hope they do. For those of you who maybe don't remember, Ben Franklin was an emissary or a person from the states, the colonies that would go back and forth to England and sit in on Parliament. Talking to Sir William Howe from the British, they probably knew each other. So let's hope, I said. There was a lot of talk that night among the officers and soldiers from Brooklyn Fort about the chances for peace. Most of them didn't want peace. They wanted to fight and sink every British ship in the bay and kill every British soldier that dared set a foot on American soil. They never seemed to think that they might be killed too. It was curious to me that they didn't. Mr. Pennywell said, young men never think about death. That's why they make good soldiers. Not so many of them came to the tavern that day, and every day fewer and fewer came. I kept asking about Chad, asking those I had asked before and those I hadn't. Then one night at the end of the week, I was serving 4 soldiers a bowl of Jamaican punch. One of them knew Chad by name and promised to carry word to him. I wrote out a message. I said that his father was dead and that I was at the Lamb and Lion Tavern waiting for him. I'll see Chad Bishop tonight, the soldier promised me. The next morning, I woke again to the sounds of drums and marching feet. Chad did not appear that day nor the next. For a week and more, the sounds of coming battles began my day. I prayed for Chad each morning when I got up and when I went to bed at night. Early one morning, Mr. Pennywell came running into the kitchen while I was making bread. He was so excited I scarcely could understand him as he spoke. My friend John Butler just stopped by, he said. He tells me the British Army is on the move. Their tents over on Staten Island are still standing, but 10,000 of their men have marched all night. A battle's coming, a big one. I pushed away the dough I was kneading. Where? At Brooklyn Fort? Likely, Mr. Pennywell said, everywhere around this end of the Long Island. The British struck the next morning. A thunderous roar shook the tavern windows and rattled cups. The roar of cannon went on most of the day. That and the far-off rattle of muskets. A farmer dropped in to sell cabbages and potatoes, eager to get rid of the produce before the British soldiers raided his farm. No rebel soldiers came to the tavern from Brooklyn Fort or from anywhere else. But a few days later, the British came, a half dozen officers at first, then dozens more, until the tavern was full all day and into the night. No soldiers ever came because it was against the rules of the British Army for them to mix with the officers. Mr. Pennywell hired 2 farm girls to help out in the kitchen and moved me inside to make change at the bar. Mrs. Pennywell gave me a pair of shoes with silver buckles to wear and a pink dress trimmed in white lace ruffles. You look like a picture, she said. I've seen ugly pictures, I answered. A pretty picture, she replied. It was the first time I had ever been called pretty in the 15 years of my life. The British officers had good manners. They said, please and thank you, miss, and may I bother you. But the Hessians were different. They were very tall, fierce-looking men, and as I found out, really had blonde hair and blonde mustaches, which they had blackened with black shoe polish. They bragged a great deal about how they never took prisoners, but ran them through with a single thrust of their bayonets. I hated to serve them at the bar and didn't after the first day. They were German Hessians, mercenaries, like private hire people. Let's see. The British officers smiled whenever I asked them if they knew my brother, Chad Bishop, but I kept asking, and at last one of them, Major Sterling, helped me. It happened in this way. Since most of the officers wore wigs, Mr. Pennywell, hoping to increase his profits, turned one of his closets into a powder room, like one he'd seen in New York. He cut a round hole in the door, big enough for a man to put his head through, and put a table in the closet and set up 3 candles in a holder. At 5 o'clock each night, he moved me from the bar to the closet. I sat inside for an hour with a comb and brush. An officer who wanted his wig fixed thrust his head through the hole. I covered his face with a cloth cone. Then I combed his wig and dusted it with a sweet smelling powder. I could do 4 wigs in an hour. It was while I was powdering Major Sterling's wig that he said he would help me find my brother. I'll give you a note to Captain Cunningham, he said. Cunningham is in charge of all the rebel prisoners, but there are thousands of prisoners. You'll need to be patient. That Chad might be a prisoner had been my hope since the first day of the battle. We had got news at the tavern that Brooklyn Fort had fallen to the British, but that most of its defenders and other soldiers around Gowanus Bay had escaped in the dark of a rainy night and fled in the hundreds of boats across the river to New York. But the British had pursued them and captured the city and taken many prisoners. Major Sterling wrote a note for me to Captain Cunningham. I thanked him for his help and put it carefully away in the packet in my dress. That night, I got out the money I had hidden under the bed and the tips I had earned in the bar, and counted it. I had in British gold coins and silver, £1 and 3 shillings. I looked out at the bay where British lights were shining on the water. The night was clear and windless. It smelled of the sea, but along with the sea was the dreadful smell that came in every night, the smell of dead soldiers. General Howe had not bothered to bury the patriots he had killed. Could Chad be among them, I wondered? I got out Mrs. Jessup's Bible and read until dawn, praying on my knees at the end. Oh, dreadful. Okay, so we just read chapters 8 and 9. I'm going to stop sharing there. Okay, I'll come back and read more.